Welcome to this week's podcast, Takeaways. I'm your host, Jason Fitzgerald, and I'm joined as ever by Paul Stringfellow and Wayne Miller. Takeaways, the podcast taking IT's biggest challenges and chopping them down into small little bite-sized chunks. So this week we are looking at identity lifecycle management and why it's important to manage your identities and secure them correctly. So Paul, why is that important?
That is indeed a big tech issue that we are going to slice down into little tech-sized bites.
Absolutely.
But you're absolutely right. We've talked on previous podcasts actually about phishing. And part of the reason that phishing is so prevalent as a cybersecurity attack is because the thing that your cyber criminal is after is identity. They want your username and password so they can log on to stuff, because it's way easier than doing that kind of Hollywood movie thing of trying to hack their way through your multiple layers of security. It's way easier if I just know Wayne's username and password to get into his account and steal stuff. And so identity is constantly a threat. It's the thing that the cyber criminals are after. So if we just boil it down, we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by identity later. But in terms of for now, let's talk about usernames and passwords. So usernames and passwords, they're always a threat because actually as a cyber criminal, and like we said, that's why phishing attacks are so prevalent, because a cyber criminal, if I can get those things, I can get in.
Yeah.
And so why has identity become a problem for us? So identity becomes a problem for us because it's something that's really difficult for us to manage. And our users, have got so many identities, so many usernames and passwords that they're trying to manage. And as organizations, we've got so many usernames and passwords. If you think the way our infrastructure has changed, we've gone from, we'd have a server in our computer room, and we'd have an email server and a database server, and we'd maybe have a Microsoft Active Directory, we'd have all those kind of things in place. And that was kind of the only place we stored an identity. But now we've got things like Microsoft 365, we might have Salesforce, we might have a payroll system that's run online, our account system might be run online. We've got all of these places where we've got identities. And you show interestingly using that phrase identity lifecycle management. It's because those things are so difficult for us to stay on top of and to manage. It's why it becomes a threat to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, we were chatting before when we were figuring out podcasts that we were going to do, and we were talking about identity. I was asking, what is it, which we've spoken about. Can you buy something that helps with identity? But it sounds to me, from what you were telling me, it's more of a framework of the way you should work.
Yeah, I think it's more of a discipline. When we look at the identity life cycle, account gets created, it gets managed, and ultimately, if someone leaves the organization, the account needs to be terminated. So how do we manage those separate areas effectively? So when a user starts in the organization, how do we make sure that they've got access to what they need to do their job, but not much more outside of that? If we look at industry best practice, we should have the least permissive model. So you need the permissions to do your job, but not much more outside of that. But if you think about kind of ongoing management of that account, as that user gets maybe promoted, their job role changes, those permissions are going to change for that user, or they may change to gain access to files or systems that they didn't have access to previously. And that could be on-prem systems, could be file shares. We've got access to finance department files, for example, whereas previously they didn't. So how do we manage that and make sure that the permissions remain applicable to that user, but again, no more so, no more permissive than what they need to do their job? And then should they leave, how do we terminate that account correctly, so that it is correctly terminated? So when we look at on-prem systems, we might say, well, if it's 100% on-prem and we close down the Active Directory account, for example, then that account is gone. You can't log in anywhere else. The challenge comes in, and as Paul's mentioned, when we look at cloud services, closing down that account on-prem may not go and close down all of the other accounts for all of the cloud services that user's got access to. And maintaining a record of what that user has access to can be quite difficult. So how do we make that easier? So there are tools that we can use. So Azure AD is quite a good example. For example, we can have a user account that exists on-prem that is hooked into, say, Dropbox, for example. So they use the same login across those two services, and that Dropbox could be LinkedIn as well, or it could be a whole host of different cloud services, so that when that account is closed down in one place, it's closed down in all the places on there.
Okay.
So where that's important is to do with risk. If that account you believe is closed down actually still exists in Dropbox, and that Dropbox account gets infiltrated, so it gets breached, someone can log into it, not only if the attacker is able to see what the person had access to in Dropbox, but they can use that to launch an attack from as well. So that's that's a challenge in itself.
And I think, as Jason was saying, because you're looking at, can I buy something that helps me to fix it? I mean, to a degree, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you can buy solutions that will certainly help. But Jason's absolutely right in terms of, identity is a far-reaching problem. And because it's a far-reaching problem, it's also a far-reaching problem to solve. So, the reason, we've talked in a previous episode, you can find them on the Garden Systems website, but we talked in a previous episode about phishing, why phishing is so prevalent. We've mentioned it here as well. It's because by stealing that credential, it gives you access to lots and lots of things. But the thing Jason was talking about there, actually, that simplification of the way you look at identity is extremely important, because the challenge when it comes to identity is that complexity, the amount of identities we try and place, the places where we hold identity. So one of those things in simplification, get all your identities into one place.
Yeah.
Okay, one truth, yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's a brilliant phrase for it, actually. One truth, there's one truthful source of identity. And what that allows us to do, and ideally, if you're going to make this kind of really slick and, and kind of, you've got that capability inside an organization, you've got a HR system. Let your HR people be the people responsible for identity, because they know who's coming into an organization and who's leaving an organization. So the idea that new starter comes in, have a process that automates the creation of that identity into all the places it needs to be, but only the places it needs to be. Because that kind of, as I said before, it's interesting Jason introduced this as identity lifecycle management, because it's absolutely true, because some of the issues that you'll get because you've not done the identity lifecycle. We've talked in previous episodes about that idea that, if you look at things like you've been pwned, probably shouldn't say porn, should we? That's a whole different idea. But the idea that you have had your credentials leaked through something else that you maybe don't even know they've been leaked. Well, they're the kind of things that a cyber criminal, and the more we've moved into cloud, the easier that becomes. If somebody finds your username and password, a version of somewhere, well, what's the things they're going to try? Well, I'll try Microsoft 365. I'll try Google Workspace. I'll try Salesforce. I'll try, Dropbox, whatever. I'll try a whole bunch of popular SaaS services and see if those credentials get me in anyway. That's almost like 101 cyber attacking. So, finding ways to kind of deal with this, I think is really important. And there are technology solutions out there that can help. Things. You look at people like Okta, who have built entire businesses around building identity management platforms. But part of what they will add to this, and I think something that's valuable, and you see this in Microsoft 365 as well, is that there is a level of intelligence around the way your identities are being used. It's one of the things you can look for example, in security and identity. Somebody tries to log in. Is that login following the usual traits of that user? Are they logging in from somewhere we recognize? Is it somewhere a bit odd? Are they logging in from a country they should never be logging in from? So they're the kind of things we can look at. But you can also look at, has that user had a recent phishing attempt, for example? So have we spotted in part of our infrastructure a phishing email coming to that user, and now we're seeing them trying to log in from Russia? Or are we doing, Wayne logged in from Liverpool this morning, 15 minutes later, he's logging in from Thailand. Well, he probably isn't doing both of those things. So there's lots of things that we can use identity for, and lots of tools we've got available to us to understand identity. But loads of it comes down to what Jason was getting at before. Loads of it comes down to process. Have I got a good process? And we talked in our Cyber Essentials episode actually about this. If you've got a good process that says user creation, user deletion, what do we do about it? So that kind of good practice is a huge part of securing identity.
Yeah, and that tooling sits on top of that and enables additional features, isn't it? If we look at Okta and we look at Azure AD, ultimately what they're doing is they are simplifying that discipline, isn't it? I close down the account when I don't need it, and I know it gets closed down over here, but also the MFA piece as well. If the cloud service provider doesn't offer MFA, how do we make sure that we're giving the MFA to that account? Okay, well, let's integrate into an Okta or a Azure AD, for example. Integrate it into that because we're doing the MFA there, because that's handling the login. So it gives you a lot more security, a lot less risk managing it in one place.
And that's a big part of the approach, is making sure, so if we, we've talked around this a lot about understand why identity is important. You've got to have identity. You've got your usernames and passwords to get logged on. Great, we need to be able to do those things. But it's a target. It's a massive target. So understand, how do we do things like securing it? So things like looking at user behavior, our things like impossible logins. Can Wayne really log on from Liverpool and Thailand within 15 minutes of each other? Well, no. So one of those things is not true. So let's raise that risk. Has that user been part of a phishing attempt recently? Well, if so, there's probably more risk associated with that user. So then how do we protect those? So simple things like, hashtag multi-factor everything, that's something to think about. If I can use MFA inside of an application, then use MFA. MFA in itself is not without the threat of compromise. But if we do that alongside using, kind of user intelligence, so, are other users doing things that we should be able to do? If they're not, can we apply another factor of authentication? And then, of course, there's looking at how we might, in a future episode, we're going to talk about this, looking at how we might modernize the way that we allow users access to our system. So rather than usernames and passwords, with passwords being inherently insecure, really, how do we move away from that? But, so bit of a teaser, that's for a future episode. Everyone do stay tuned. But, so they're the kind of things. So it's a really big part of the problem. But a huge part of the solution is process, is getting an identity lifecycle management process in place, rather than a tool to do it, but having a process in place. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, excellent.
So key takeaway? Process
the heck out of it.
Have a process.
Yeah, I think that would be my. I mean, it was your key takeaway, but I'm happy to steal it and claim it as my own.
You can borrow that.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'd go with simplify. Simplify where you can. Make your job a little bit easier. Don't manage all of those accounts. Make it easier for yourself. Okay, that's great. I think that's a great episode. We hope you've enjoyed it. New episodes drop weekly. We're available everywhere you can subscribe to a podcast, as well as our website and YouTube. We'll catch you next week.